everybody, and welcome to our training video talking about the news and supporting children's wellbeing. We are Saoirse and Paul from the NewsWise team here at the Guardian Foundation, and we're also joined today by Flo, who is a senior subject specialist at the PSHE Association. NewsWise is a cross-curricular news literacy programme for 7 to 11-year-olds. We are run in partnership by the Guardian Foundation, the National Literacy Trust and the PSHE Association. We offer a fully planned suite of lessons with more than 100 resources, pupil workshops, a chance to hear from real journalists, and CPD for teachers. The whole project has been created by literacy, news, and PSHE education specialists. So let's get straight into thinking about how news can impact children's wellbeing.
So learning about news and wellbeing are not necessarily two things that we think of together. When we're teaching news in the classroom, it's often as part of an English or a literacy unit with a focus on reading and writing skills. And while this is really essential learning, how often when we're teaching a unit on news do we also focus on wellbeing? If we consider learning about the news as covering both literacy and PSHE education, we can see there's a clear and vital link. In PSHE, pupils might be learning about making safe choices online, or about things that can affect their health and well-being. News has a clear link to both of these. Even as adults, the news cycle can be overwhelming, so it'd be irresponsible to assume that this is not the case for children too. Teaching news in the classroom in a safe and meaningful way is a perfect opportunity to also teach the knowledge, skills, and behaviours that will help pupils to engage positively with news stories. The strategies we'll look at in this session offer practical activities as well as guidance for approaches when there are concerns about difficult or distressing news stories. These can be applied to many difficult news stories in your classroom. How might news and media affect children and young people's well-being? Pause the video for a moment and think about how the news impacts the pupils you work with. Both what is reported in the news and how it's reported can affect young people's well-being, particularly when a major news story breaks. Young people, as well as adults, can feel an acute or increased sense of fear, worry, or anxiety. The news can also make young people feel like the world is a sad place. So as well as feeling a shared empathy for people in the story, it can lead to feelings of hopelessness. Some might have an angry response, which, depending on how this is managed, could manifest in different ways for them. The Children's Society's Good Childhood Report says that we know that young people worry about society and global issues. For those who may have personal experience related to the story, reading about it again can even re-traumatise. This is as if they're living it again, experiencing the same or heightened feelings. And young people's interest can be spiked, and they might feel excited. They might want to find out more or be inspired to take action by a news story. They might want to take on a crusade or even onboard others, which, depending on the story and the source that may be reporting it, it could be something entirely negative or entirely positive. The danger is that stories that seek to scare or use shock tactics are often the ones that cause this sort of excitement response, which can lead to harmful behaviours. But of course, there are also news stories that make us smile and laugh and that help to brighten up our day. Developing news literacy is important in lots of ways. Mis- and disinformation about what's happening in the world, especially in the context of global conflict, is one of the things that many people are concerned about. We know that the spread of fake news can have a harmful effect on children's well-being, and it's why lots of teachers want to develop critical skills with their pupils at the moment. Research from the National Literacy Trust highlighted not only that children do not have the skills needed to spot the fake news, but that half of them are worried about this too. Also, many teachers feel that fake news is skewing young people's worldview and having a harmful effect on their well-being. Today, we'll be covering different ways of managing this and supporting your pupils to look out for their own well-being as they navigate the news.
Okay, so for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what we need to do when teaching about news in the classroom and share some tips and best practice for creating and maintaining a safe climate in which to discuss the news. And all of the principles that we're going to cover can be applied when discussing or learning about any news story, though as we're also going to think about, teachers should be mindful about which stories are appropriate to discuss in the classroom and with the particular children that they're working with. So when teaching PSHE education lessons or UK equivalents about the news, or when discussing news more generally, it's really important that we're creating a safe climate. And by that, we mean a climate or environment in which everyone feels able to participate and engage in the learning, regardless of what their own experiences might be. And this is especially important because every pupil in our class will relate to news stories differently, depending on their background, their identity, or the particular experiences that they've had. So there are different ways in which we can achieve a safe climate. And the first is to agree ground rules with pupils. So examples of ground rules might include asking pupils to listen to each other and work together with respect, maybe to take a non-judgmental approach to different points of view, to use kind words and not share personal stories without permission. It's most effective if pupils help to create the class ground rules, and these should then be reinforced or modelled during the lesson. For example, it's possible that when we're teaching about the news, pupils might express views that stigmatise others, and if that happens, then we can refer back to our ground rules and, of course, to our school behaviour policy. But what you'll find is actually just having these ground rules in place can also be a really great way of setting and agreeing expectations for the discussions and helps minimise the chances of those kinds of hurtful comments happening during the lesson. We might include a ground rule like the conversation stays in the room to make sure pupils maintain respectful boundaries and don't take conversations into the playground, for example. It's just important, however, that pupils are aware of those concepts of confidentiality, the limits of this, and know that if adults in the classroom hear something that makes them worried for a pupil's safety, they will need to share that information. The second thing that we can do to create that safe climate is use distancing techniques. And this means not making the learning about pupils' own behaviours or experiences, but exploring the topic from an objective standpoint. And we can do this by creating a character or a scenario, but something that pupils can relate to. So if teaching about the news and wellbeing, for example, rather than asking pupils, how would you feel or what would you do, we can ask questions like, how might the character feel, or what could the character do in this situation? And using distancing techniques helps to protect pupils who might have personal experiences related to the news story that we're exploring. But they also allow pupils to explore situations objectively without the need to disclose personal information in front of their peers. We might, however, include an opportunity in the lesson for private personal reflection, so pupils can think about how they'd apply the learning to their lives, but without needing to share that with others. So the third thing we want to do is choose real news stories carefully. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it's really important that teachers think carefully about the stories that they share with the class. This is especially important when so many news stories out there will be highly emotive for our pupils. We really have that duty of care to avoid inducing feelings of shock or fear or shame in the news stories or even the images that we use in the classroom. And that's regardless of what we think pupils might have already encountered outside of the classroom. So we want to think really carefully about our pupils before we teach. What's age appropriate? What's their background? Are there any particular sensitivities? And we should make sure that we fully understand the school's safeguarding policy as well. So the fourth thing that we can do is reassure pupils. And this is something that teachers naturally do anyway, but it can just be as simple as making pupils aware of the range of emotions that people might experience from the news, and really normalising and recognising that different people have different reactions. But it's also important to recognise there may be pupils who feel worried or scared or potentially unsafe in response to stories in the news. For these pupils, we want to think carefully again about the news stories we're choosing, but also encourage them to talk to someone about how they're feeling. And I'll say more about that in a moment. We also know, number 5 here, from parents and teachers, that children are likely to have lots of questions about the news. To not answer these questions or to pretend that nothing has happened can be counterproductive. It's important to answer those questions honestly, but in an age-appropriate way. This can minimise possible fears, but also make sure children are clear about separating the facts about an event from speculation, rumour, or false information. And later in this video, we'll look at an exercise you can use in the classroom to do this. So we want to be really encouraging and valuing questions, but we also want to be handling them safely. And one way of doing this is with a question box where pupils can post questions anonymously if they wish. So this can be kept somewhere so it's accessible in the classroom and pupils can use it in related lessons or at any other time that they have a question during the school day. This means pupils don't have to ask challenging questions in front of peers. It means they're likely to be more open, and it also means that you have more time to prepare the answers. The sixth thing that we want to think about is clarifying the facts and ensuring a balance of information. So it's important when we're giving answers to pupils and discussing the news more generally that we give them a factual and age-appropriate response. We need to be clear when formulating our response that we're not sharing any speculation or rumour, only factual information. But also remember that teachers don't need to go into a huge amount of detail or specifics either if that's not going to be age appropriate. It's also important to be balanced in our responses, so thinking carefully about language choices. Remember also to look out for any comments from pupils that include speculation, rumour or misinformation, and do try to challenge this when possible. It's also, though, completely okay to say, I'm not sure about that, I'll come back to you later if you're not sure about something on the spot. Okay, so finally, we also want to make sure when we're creating that safe climate, we're signposting pupils to where they can get support. And that might be you at the end of the lesson, reminding pupils that you're there if they're worried and need to talk. But it's also important that they know different options for where they can get support, as this can mean they're more likely to get help from a source they feel comfortable with when they need it. It's also important to recognise that we may not always be the kind of expert or the most appropriate source to answer pupils' questions. So thinking about those different options where pupils can get help, for younger children, adults at home or school are going to be the first port of call. For older pupils, there might be other trustworthy sources of information we can direct them to, such as the Childline website you can see on the screen here. So these are some of the key elements of creating a safe learning environment when teaching about the topic. And for further guidance on this, you can see the NewsWise website and our document on handling complex issues safely on the PSHE Association website. And you can find a link to that in the video description. So, while we can use these tips to create that safe learning environment when we're delivering planned, sequenced PSHE education or equivalent lessons, sometimes a major news story breaks and teachers will recognise that pupils would benefit from having a discussion. So, of course, we wouldn't usually advocate for a knee-jerk response in PSHE education, but when a major global event takes place, teachers might need to respond more immediately. So this is a starting point for a discussion framework that might be helpful. The first question we might ask is what has happened and what is happening in response? And when a major story is happening, it's likely that pupils will have been exposed to the story as well as discussions around it outside of the classroom. And there might be lots of different sources that they're getting their information from. So older children in the primary phase might have mobiles, and despite the age restrictions, it's possible some of them will be on social media. We know that unverified stories and disinformation can spread quickly and widely, especially on social media platforms. So this initial question can be a useful way of identifying any misconceptions or misinformations that pupils might hold. It also gives an opportunity to clarify the known factual information in an age-appropriate way. Secondly, we can ask, how can we support our own well-being? And this question is really to get children thinking about what might support their well-being. And we're going to look at an activity later that explores this in a little bit more detail. But what we don't want to be doing here is making any assumptions about how your pupils might be feeling and really recognising that everyone responds differently. And finally, we can ask, how can we help the well-being of others? And this is a really good opportunity to encourage that sense of community and cohesion in your classroom. And we can do this by considering other questions like, how might others be feeling at this time? Will everyone feel the same way in response to the news? What can we do to make sure that everyone in our school community feels supported and safe? Following these discussions, or perhaps through questions that you might see appearing in the question box that I mentioned, you might judge that actually there are other areas of teaching that need to be addressed. For example, you might need to revisit topics like identifying and challenging stereotypes, or perhaps look at areas like inclusion.
Let's go into a little more detail about how we can challenge misconceptions and misinformation in a safe and responsible way. There are always going to be misconceptions around major news stories, and misinformation can make them seem even more overwhelming and scary than they already are. As Flo has mentioned a moment ago, it's vital that we focus on the known facts when we're talking about news stories. We should also refer to official sources of information when we're talking about news stories. There are lots of child-friendly news sources that give clear and factual accounts of what's happening around the world. Many of them produce helpful explainers too, such as Newsround and First News. There are also organisations like Full Fact and BBC Verify who are checking the facts and debunking misinformation, which will help you to speak about these stories accurately. These are targeted at adults though, so you should be mindful of sharing these directly with children. When children are very worried about a news story, offering reassurance and positive framing is helpful. For example, to show the support offered from around the world in times of conflict or crisis. Also, with older children, you could discuss how global diplomacy works to promote peace in everyone's interest. Knowing that misinformation can spread rapidly during breaking news, it's important to remind pupils to question the information that they come across. We've created a NewsWise code to help with this, and we'll talk more about this in detail later. Of course, it's really important to tailor your discussion and the information you share to the age of your pupils. With younger children, maybe discuss the basic information first and then focus on the discussion on how to manage their well-being. With sort of upper primary age children, you can explore the situation further by considering the difference between factual information with opinion, speculation, and rumour. You can also discuss strategies for managing feelings and come up with ideas for this together. With older children, you might then want to introduce real articles or items from the media to focus your discussion.
Both of the NewsWise units of work have lessons on managing feelings about the news. This is an example of one activity from our lesson for 9 to 11-year-olds. We also have a similar activity in our lesson for 7 to 9-year-olds. This is a great example of those distancing techniques that Flo mentioned earlier when talking about how to create a safe learning environment. The character Maxie is used in this scenario, and pupils learn that Maxie has watched a news story about a fire at a zoo. Pupils learn a little more about the news story, and then, through discussion, they explore how characters might feel in response to different news story scenarios. So let's have a look at this activity. I'll read the scenario, and after that, pause the video and think about how you would answer these two questions. How might Maxie feel after reading this story, and in what ways might people react differently? So, Maxie is watching a news story about a fire at a zoo. The devastating fire was started by vandals in the middle of the night. It is not yet clear if they deliberately started the fire. The zookeepers worked all night to try and move the animals to safety, but sadly over 40 animals died. Some of them were rare species. Officials have warned some of the animals escaped and may still be on the loose. So think about those two questions and think about how you might answer them. The idea is to draw out the different things that might affect how strongly the characters feel about the story. For example, if I tell you that Maxie really loves gorillas, or if Maxie lives really close to the zoo, or if Maxie is really easily scared, then that's going to affect how Maxie might feel or respond to this story. This is important for pupils to understand because it helps them to recognise and have empathy for the different feelings others might experience in response to the news. This will help them to be more sensitive and considerate in discussions.
So this activity provides pupils with different strategies for managing their feelings related to the news. And through this activity, we're trying to make pupils aware of the impact that news can have on people and really reinforce that any emotional response is okay. But we're also trying to equip them with practical strategies to support their well-being, while really importantly acknowledging that the right action is very much going to depend on the person. So there's not a one-size-fits-all approach when it comes to managing well-being and managing feelings. For example, it might be that one person finds that writing about the story helps them to process it and understand it in their own way. For somebody else, it might make them think about it too much. And this gets children and young people to really consider how different wellbeing approaches work for different people. And we can also give them the space to reflect on what might work for them. So some key questions that could be useful for this activity are what would be helpful and what would be less helpful. We want pupils to identify that certain common behaviours may not be a healthy way to respond. So things like trying to forget about it or reading more about the same story. Whereas some of these behaviours might be more healthy and helpful, such as talking to a trusted adult. And finally, this activity can also allow pupils to explore how one person's action can affect others. So if a young person reads an upsetting story, what's the impact going to be if they choose to share that story around with others? By starting to talk about this, we get pupils into the habit of thinking about how news might make someone else feel before sharing it.
Opinion, rumour, and speculation can spread easily in the context of news stories, especially when they're breaking, and this can help to spread false or misleading information. An important lesson for upper primary pupils is to be able to spot all of these. It's worth noting that this meets many of the curriculum objectives across many subject areas, including distinguishing between fact and opinion, which comes up in reading curricula across the UK. Opinion is, of course, somebody's personal thoughts or views on something. It may be a response to the facts, but it will differ from person to person, and it's not the same as factual information. Trustworthy sources of news often publish opinion pieces as well, but these should be very distinct from news items. It's worth noting that listening to the opinions of others and forming your own can be a really important part of understanding a news story, but it shouldn't be confused with getting to the facts. Speculation can form much of the discussion around a news event too, even from reputable news sources, but it's also important to remember that this is still at best just an educated guess, and a number of factors could result in a different outcome. Rumours are best understood as stories passed on from one person to another, and they might not be true at all. Referencing rumours and playground gossip is a good way to help children understand this. We need to encourage children to understand the difference between fact, opinion, rumour, and speculation. Knowing the difference between each is a good start, and people can then move on to spotting the language that's typically used in each. Some questions you could use include, what clues are there that this is a speculation or rumour? Or what will be the consequences of believing this? So here are some example statements about a real news story. One is an opinion, one is speculation, and one is a rumour. All of these are based on what people actually said in response to a gorilla escaping from London Zoo. So number one says, I heard tons of people are locked inside the buildings at London Zoo while the gorilla is banging on the glass. Number two says, I feel sorry for the gorilla. I think he was probably bored. I'm glad he's escaped. And number three says, I wonder if the door to the gorilla's den wasn't properly locked. I reckon this means that no one's safe at London Zoo. Pause the video for a second and think about which one of those statements is opinion, which one is speculation, and which one is a rumour. As you can see, option 2 was an opinion. It's someone expressing how they feel about the gorilla being in captivity. The third statement was speculation. If you consider the language that's being used, this is clearly somebody suggesting what might have happened and what the consequences might be. And finally, the first statement was rumour. The words I heard show us that this information has not been confirmed. This activity you've just seen was based on our Rumour Has It activity, which features in the unit of work for 9 to 11-year-olds. You can find the full activity along with the rest of the lesson at the NewsWise website. The lesson would also allow you to look in more detail at the language of fact, opinion, speculation, and rumour, but it can also be a good way into questioning the source of information as well. So in this context, pupils can also look at where the statements about the gorilla came from. For example, is the London Zoo social media account going to provide more credible information than the one called Jim Bob that we know nothing else about? These questions can be applied to any news story that your pupils are unsure of as well. So who shared it? Are they a trusted professional news source? Have you heard of them before? So before we move on, it's worth noting that younger pupils may see their parents, older siblings, or other adults as sources of absolute authority. If they bring this to you in a discussion, remember to always emphasise the known facts about a situation rather than commenting directly on or being seen to judge my mum says type comment. We don't want to undermine what other authority figures in their life are saying, as this can leave children struggling to know who to trust. You should always just focus on the known facts.
Managing information and making reliable choices is a key skill that we want children to develop. We also know that misinformation and not knowing what to trust can be a source of anxiety for young people. To build on asking questions about where information has come from and whether it should be trusted, the NewsWise code can be used for this. This activity from our unit of work for 9 to 11-year-olds provides pupils with the information they need to stop, question, check, and decide. Using the NewsWise code means that pupils are taught to stop when they come across information online before instantly believing or sharing it. Question the source of the information to see if it is one you know and trust, or if it looks like it is trustworthy. You might ask, how do they describe themselves? What other stories have they shared in the past? And do they seem believable? We then check, which means checking the coverage and whether more than one reliable source is verifying the information. When checking other sources, your pupils will also want to check whether all sources are reporting the same detail or if there are some inconsistencies. Checking might also include checking whether quotes from different sources are included. They could also ask, is it a fact or an opinion? And are the facts supported by evidence? Once your pupils have been through all of those steps, they can then decide whether to believe or share the information. The NewsWise code can be especially helpful in this information climate, especially with the popularity of video sharing platforms like TikTok. This is a good example of where some users are quick to accept one source of information, but we want our children and young people to feel empowered to look elsewhere for information. To help with using the NewsWise code, we have also got the NewsWise Navigator, which you can see here. It gives helpful questions to prompt your pupils as they work through the steps of the NewsWise code. Our unit of work for 7 to 9-year-olds also includes a simpler lesson on distinguishing between real and fake news. The NewsWise code is broken down further, and pupils are given extra prompts to consider when investigating a news story that they suspect could be fake.
Once your pupils are confident in spotting fake news, you can also look at the consequences of it. In this activity, pupils can begin to understand what happens when fake news is shared and believed, and the reasons that it might cause anxiety or fear. Pupils read 2 examples of fake stories, inferring how they might make someone feel and what they might motivate someone to do. It's worth noting that these are not real examples, but have been developed just for the purposes of this lesson. I'm going to read this fake story. After, pause the video and consider how you might answer these questions. How might someone feel reading this story? What would happen if someone believed this story? Could it affect how they think or act? What's the motivation of the story or writer? Why has this story been made up? You could also consider how the article tries to make the reader feel an extreme emotion and the types of fake news that might cause harm. You won't believe what a zoo did to these adorable 2-day-old tiger cubs. Visitors to a UK zoo have reported that 2 newly born tiger cubs have been torn away from their mother at only 2 days old. One tourist said, the mother tiger looked so distressed. She was scraping at the bars of her cage and crying. We could hear the cubs yelping. It was awful. An animal rights group has arrived outside the zoo this evening demanding that it be closed down. This is an outrage, one of the protesters said. We think the cubs may have been sold off to a fur company. Those poor cubs. I can't believe a zoo let this happen. To bring this story back to video sharing platforms like TikTok, this can be useful if young people have been exposed to questionable information. They can begin to interrogate what the purpose of the video is, why someone might have made it, why they want to get lots of views, and how they're trying to do that. After this, they can ask, does that change how trustworthy it is? And the final resource we're going to look at today is our Happy News project. This is a sequence of activities that encourages children to focus on positive news stories, which can help to balance out some of the more overwhelming and negative news stories. For this project, pupils can work in mini editorial teams to research and produce a happy news story. It could be a video, an audio recorded report, or a written one, where pupils design the front page of their own happy newspaper. We also provide a template for this. It's a great activity for giving pupils a real audience too, as their stories can be shared with the school community to help spread some joy and positivity. You can find the link to our Happy News project on our webpage, where we provide a list of suggested learning activities alongside tips to help transform your classroom into a newsroom. We've also created a home learning version of this that you can find on our family page too. Can you think of an example of a positive or uplifting news story that your pupils could report on? Pause the video for a moment and ask yourself what story or stories they could report on and why it might be a good one to choose for your pupils in particular. A top tip when picking any news story for your children to write about is to keep it as local as possible, which shows children that positive things happening in their own community are also newsworthy.
An important way of looking after our well-being when reading the news is to seek out more positive stories that give us a break from the overwhelming and negative ones. In the context of global conflict, it might not be appropriate to divert children's attention with light or fluffy, happy news stories. Instead, you might want to focus on some of the more positive stories of solidarity and generosity that have been coming out of, for example, areas of conflict. In this way, you're not ignoring that the issue, such as the conflict, is happening, but you're not only focusing on the scary and upsetting stories either. There are some brilliant child-friendly news sites where you can find factual news reports about major stories, and we've collated a range of these sources on our website. Some of these curate their own collections of happy news stories specifically for children, including Newsround.
Okay, so just to summarise the key messages that we've explored today. First of all, it's important to reassure pupils that it's okay to feel worried or even overwhelmed in response to the news. And there are strategies that we can teach pupils to help them to manage their feelings, whether that's discussing news stories with a trusted adult, to recognising how the news makes them feel. When discussing news in the classroom, it's really important to have a safe environment and to think carefully about the stories we choose. So using distancing techniques, for examples, which is those characters in scenarios, and asking, for example, how a character might feel when reading a news story, or what could a character do in a given situation. Throughout a news-based topic, a feelings question or worry box can be a good resource for children to share their thoughts and also give you an idea of anything you might need to address in your PSHE, education or UK equivalent teaching. And of course, it's really important to have that balanced news diet, including positive news stories, and to stress that taking a break from news can be really helpful in managing well-being. Instead, pupils could do a different activity that they enjoy and that supports their well-being.
Throughout this video, we've mentioned a lot of our resources. All of these are available absolutely free from our website. You can see the address on the screen now, and the link is in the video description. On our website, you'll also find the other training videos in this series.